So guys, we are about to start. I did say all protocol has been observed. I can see a lot of our colleagues on the participants or on the participant section. And thank you for your attendance. Without further ado, we've got an exciting topic to engage on. So I just want to give you a bit of context in terms of how we got here and what's the purpose for this session. As you know, the National Upgrading Support Program started from 2009, and we emanate from the Outcome 8 Delivery Agreement, and we are established to promote incremental upgrading, support the department's targets, and improve a programmatic approach to strengthen coordination, as well as to create this cadre of professionals in informal settlement upgrading. Now, NUSP has 3 activity streams, and this specific engagement comes from or emanates from the 3rd activity stream, which is capacity development and training of practitioners in the field of informal settlements upgrading. And now, as you guys know, COVID really messed us up because we had a really intensive program of training colleagues in informal settlements upgrading, and Shisaka was appointed, and we had this fantastic 3-day fantastic 3-year program, and then COVID came and cut that up quite nicely. And so we decided that as opposed to losing the year, let us come up with a series of webinars where we still keep our colleagues in provinces, metros, and municipalities up to date and still keep informal settlements upgrading as a key agenda item for all developments in metros and municipalities. And so this is the first webinar. In my conclusion, I'll give you details about the next 2, but without further ado, colleagues, welcome. And I will now hand you over to Monty, or was it Clive? I think it was Monty who will take us through the presentation. Monty, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mala, and welcome everybody. This is a very important departure for us because we tended to be able to engage with people on a person-to-person basis. But given, as Mala had said, given that we are faced with a crisis, we are now using technology. And what I think is quite interesting when you go through the list of participants, you have participants not only from the larger well-known municipalities, but also from the smaller municipalities that face the same kind of challenges that your bigger municipalities face. And so once again, welcome and thank you for participating. So what we want to start off with is what are the learning outcomes? And in the end, you're going to judge us whether these learning outcomes were achieved. So this webinar, as been mentioned earlier on, is part of a series run by the National Upgrading Support Program, NUSP, around the topic of in-situ upgrading for informal settlements. So that means it's the upgrading of informal settlements where they are. And we'll go into more detail about that a little later. So what this webinar is intended to assist you with is to develop an understanding of what incremental tenure is. Therefore, is what are those steps along the line that goes from people feeling least secure to more secure. To offer a sense of the legal and statutory frameworks surrounding incremental tenure, so whether it's legislation, planning legislation, or whether it is in the National Housing Code, etc., etc., will give you some sense of what the legal and statutory frameworks are. And then very importantly, I think for you, is describing how incremental tenure can be applied in the in situ upgrading process. More details of what is outlined in this webinar can be found in the booklet that we sent everybody who had registered. So the booklet that you received. So I think it's quite important that we see the technology part about us talking to you, but also the documentary part about what you can gain from the accompanying booklet. Okay, so let's recap on the types of upgrading. There are two generic approaches to upgrading. There's relocations-based approaches and in-situ-based approaches. So relocation-based approaches, there's two ways of doing it. The one is redevelopment and the other is rollover. And we will talk more about that and describe that later on. Then there's in-situ based approaches, what we're calling pure in-situ, which is where you are upgrading where people are located at the moment. Then there is reblocking, where you have to do some internal rearrangements. Then you can have a hybrid where there is pure in situ with some reblocking or some redevelopment, which in essence is there might have to be some relocations. When we look at these types of upgradings, relocation-based approaches are where redevelopment is involved. It involves relocating the residents of an informal settlement to a greenfield development, dismantling the existing shacks and developing the land for a different purpose. The classic example could be where people were relocated and a park was developed on the banks of the Yxke River in Alexandra. The picture we're showing you here is the N2 Gateway, which is in Cape Town, and shows you clearly where the shacks are and where the redevelopment at the bottom is taking place. Then we're dealing with the issue of rollover. So rollover involves moving households off the land into temporary relocation areas, what is called TRAs, which you probably are more familiar with now that we had to do some interventions in relation to the pandemic. The dismantling the shacks, then developing the site with formal sites and services and sometimes houses, and allowing the same households to move back. So you'll see in that sequence of pictures, the people are on site, moved into temporary residential units that are tin shacks, and then moved back into what we call RDP houses or more lately BNG houses. So that is the relocations-based approach, redevelopment and rollover. Now, in situ-based approaches, the point about the different approaches, we are arguing that the UISP, the Upgrading of Informal Settlements program, settlement relocation is to be only considered as a last resort in exceptional circumstances. Okay, so the preference, which is when we go to the next slide, is in situ based approaches. So pure in situ based approaches are all dwellings remain where they are currently positioned. The sites are demarcated around existing dwellings and services are installed in spaces in between the sites. Then the next issue is reblocking. And there again, you can see in the picture, it's a very dense settlement. And so what reblocking intends to do is to rearrange the existing shacks into an orderly layout so that emergency vehicles can enter and basic services can be introduced. Sometimes new shacks are provided. So if you compare those two pictures, you can see that you have to do reblocking so that services can be installed. Just want to make one point about reblocking is that it requires quite high levels of community participation. And that is something that is a theme that runs throughout the upgrading of informal settlements approaches. Then there's the hybrid, which is a mix of pure in situ with some reblocking, and in some instance, and we'll talk about that later on, in some instances, relocation. So you might, depending on the informal settlement, you might want to make your decisions on whether it's pure, requires reblocking, or it's a hybrid of a number of different approaches. Okay, so what this is based on, and when we're saying what interventions do you make, in overall terms, the National Upgrading Support Program and the people that provide technical support do a categorization of settlements at quite a high level. And there's two judgments that are made. The one is settlements that are viable for upgrading and settlements that are not viable for upgrading. So you have what is probably your your pure in situ is your full conventional upgrade, and that is everything that needs to be included: full services, top structure, formal tenure, etc. Then you have incremental upgrade with essential services, leading in most cases to eventual formalization, where the informal settlement sites are viable and appropriate, well, but where such formalization is not imminent. Then the settlements that are not viable for upgrading, so that's A and B1. B2 is they are going to be relocated, but you will provide emergency services, and relocation will take place at a later date because the area or the land is not suitable. And then you have a category C, which is immediate relocation because of dangerous circumstances, either health or safety threats, and that you need to find an alternative site and relocate people there as quickly as possible. So what we are going to concentrate on is B1, okay? Because if one looks at the current work that's been done in relation to categorization of informal settlements, what you find is that by and large, they are categorized as B1. So they're the most widespread categorization of informal settlements in the country. So the rest of this seminar or webinar is going to take you through the detail And I now want to hand over to Clive Foster, and he will continue with the presentation.
Thanks, Monty. Can people hear me?
Yes, thanks, Clive.
Okay. Afternoon, everybody. The webinar is about land tenure. So what is land tenure? Well, broadly, tenure is the way in which land and housing are held. It determines who can use the land, for how long, and under what terms or conditions. In other words, it defines the rights and responsibilities of an owner in connection with their property or their house. Now, tenure doesn't have to only be those that are codified in terms of the laws and policies. It can also be based, and as is often the case in our country, on informal customs or traditions. Now, land tenure security is the certainty, the confidence that a person has that their rights to a piece of land will be recognized and protected. And the freedom for those people to leave their land to their heirs or their descendants, or to lease land or sell property to others. Now, it's important in the context of incremental upgrading to understand that there's not a single form of tenure in settlement upgrading. It's not all about freehold ownership and title deed. There are different kinds of tenure, and those can be applied at different stages in the upgrading process. So, for example, a weak form of tenure right would be the right to short-term occupancy of a unit in an informal settlement. It could be slightly stronger, the right to be accommodated somewhere within the settlement, but not necessarily in exactly the same position as the current unit. It could be a right to be provided with a relocation site somewhere outside the settlement, or it could be a right to a specific site with fixed boundaries within the settlement. So there are different kinds of rights that can be applied at different stages in the incremental upgrading process. And we'll come back to that now. Now, tenure security in informal settlement upgrading exists on a continuum, running from very insecure tenure through to more secure forms of tenure. And our main objective in incremental upgrading, on the tenure front at least, is to move people as quickly as possible from very insecure to more secure forms of tenure. So if we take it from a resident's perspective, you could have a situation where I don't know whether my shack and my possessions will still be there when I get home tonight. Maybe the red ants are hovering. Maybe there's a massive fire risk in my settlement. But if you don't know whether your place is going to be there when you get home, that's a very, very insecure form of tenure. More secure, if we look at the other end of the spectrum, is that a household be in a position where they say, you're able to say, look, this is my site. I know where I can build on it. When I build it, any improvements I make will be permanent. Nobody will make me knock them down, and they'll be safe from fire and disaster. Nobody can take this property away from me, and so on. And in between those two extremes, there are other forms of tenure that can be applied that along the way that confer increasing amounts of tenure. And our idea and our mandate, if you like, in upgrading is to help people move along the spectrum so we get to these more secure forms of tenure as soon as possible. Now, why is tenure important? Books have been written about this. So in a nutshell, secure tenure provides important psychological benefits to the household. It generates economic opportunities. It allows households to invest in their house, allows them to capture their investment in a unit, and to do things on their property that allow them to generate an income from it. And socially, improved tenure confers improved social status. It gives people with an address, and it provides membership status within a community. All very important. Now, is secure tenure something that NUSP sucked out of its thumb a week ago? No. The tenure enhancement is an approach and a requirement that has very solid underpinnings in the policy and legislative framework. To touch on these, and these are covered in detail in your notes, the National Development Plan sets targeting the upgrading of all settlements as a target for 2030. We've got 10 years to go. And it identifies in situ upgrading as the primary method. So it's in the NDP. The IUDF, amongst other things, specifies that municipalities should develop and implement an incremental approach to land tenure in informal settlements. SPLUMA is very clear about it. It requires municipalities to integrate informal settlements into their spatial development framework and their zoning frameworks. And they talk about the progressive or incremental introduction of administration, management, engineering services, and land tenure rights to informal settlements. So as municipalities, we're obliged, in fact, under SPLUMA to do this. As Monty's mentioned, the Breaking New Ground in 2004 had established a special code, the UISP, under its new framework. And the UISP is an instrument to fast track the provision of security of tenure, basic municipal services, social and economic communities, and empowerment of residents. And then finally, if we look at just the funding instrument, this year's DORA grant framework provides substantial funding, very substantial funding for the upgrading of the informal settlements through the UISP and the UISPG. Deliverables identified within this framework includes, as well as servicing and land and other things, the number of informal settlements designated for upgrading, and that's in terms of the planning frameworks, and the number of households provided with secure tenure. So you can see there's a very strong policy underpinning for provision of tenure, improved tenure, under the incremental upgrading process. So it's all very well to have defined tenure and shown how it brings benefits and to identify how it fits into the policy frameworks. But how does one go about it? Well, in essence, what tenure rights you can provide at any single stage in the incremental upgrading process is determined by 3 work streams: legal enablement work stream, the spatial planning work stream, and a work stream we've called tenure administration. And where one stands at any stage along that process determines on the type and strength of the tenure that can be provided. Now, it's important at this stage to make the point that the legal enablement and spatial planning work streams are not there solely to deal with tenure. They're really important work streams to deal with other key parts of upgrading, including the provision of services, safety, securing safety and security. So you're not doing these 2 work streams solely for the purposes of providing secure tenure, but as you progress down these streams, what you can provide in the way of tenure is shaped by them. So let's have a little bit closer look at them one by one, and we'll start with the legal enablement work stream. The legal enablement, in a nutshell, is around securing the legal preconditions needed to confirm that a settlement can be permanently occupied, upgrading activities are authorized, and we can give residents rights to permanently occupy sites. It's important at this point to note then that simply giving a settlement a B1 categorization doesn't achieve this. And so that you've got to carry the ball from the B1 categorization into a process that allows a legal enablement of not only tenure, but also service provision and other development actions. Now, if we look at the legal enablement workstream, it's important to recognize that many settlements, many informal settlements, are located on privately owned land or land that's not under the control of the municipality or government. And equally, we have many cases, probably by far the majority of informal settlements will have land use zonings that predate the settlement or the occupation of the land informally. So you've got, most settlements will be located on land designed for open space, agriculture, some cases industry, etc. So the alignment between the zoning and the actual current use of the land are completely wrong. So in essence, to establish a legal platform for services provision and tenure, we have to do three things. We have to secure and address the fact that the underlying de jure landowner is almost always different to the people who are effectively on the land, who have de facto land ownership, land occupation rights. Secondly, then we need to deal with the spatial planning and the zoning discrepancies to align the planning status with the B1 settlement status, and associated with the B1 status, the intention to upgrade the settlement incrementally. And then we're not going to delve into this, but you also need to address from time to time the other authorizations you need to provide services and associated with that, the tenure rights, things like your water use licensing and your NEMA environmental approvals. It is, however, really, really important to recognize that land acquisition processes can and usually are very slow, expensive, and cumbersome. And we sit at the moment where we're in a gap really between new expropriation legislation and the old legislation, which is very, very seldom being utilized now. In addition to that, we have other things that complicates the process: deceased estates, challenges over how the land's valued, and many others. So the consequence of this is that the land acquisition process, whether it be from parastatal land, from private owners, etc., tends to be a long and slow process. It is critical on the tenure improvement side to understand, however, that tenure improvement and basic service provision should not and does not have to wait for the formal acquisition of the de jure rights to be completed. So that is an absolutely critical point, that you don't, and we can't, an incremental upgrade, sit back and wait for some long-term land assembly process, land acquisition process to take place. So different authorities have adopted different approaches to that. Let's have a look at the one example that's been in the process of being finalized and applied in the Etuquini municipality. It's also referred into your notes and your references. I would recommend that you delve into this in some detail. But in essence, the approach being developed by Etuquini municipality with assistance from Martin Musselhorn is that one establishes a land assembly or land acquisition program, but one recognizes at a metropolitan level, and you recognize that this process will take quite some time to do. In parallel with that process, a simplified process this is gross simplification of the process that they are following. But in essence, it's a process where notice is given to the landowner of the intent to upgrade the area. This is in case of B1 settlements. That following that, immediately following that, the settlement gets included as an incremental development area in the municipal spatial development framework as allowed by the SPLUMA. The area, immediately after incorporation of the area within the SDF, the area gets zoned to an incremental development area. One zoning, which is its associated bylaw and regs, very general regs, and this applies to the whole settlement. It predates and applies prior to individual site demarcation happening, and I'll come back to that now. And then as a longer time process, as the reblocking or the relocations and the other work necessary to allow site demarcation or site layouts to be confirmed, after that's been done, then the area can be, the zoning is upgraded to an incremental development area 2 zoning. Now the point about this legal enablement process is that it enables at this point, in fact, the provision of basic services within any settlement zone as an IDA 1. But it also, from a tenure perspective, sends a really important signal to the residents and the neighbors that this settlement is here to stay. It's going to be incrementally improved, and that knowledge, and we'll come back to how it can be codified and transferred to the residents, is quite critical for the tenure upgrading process. And then only a little bit later in some settlements, when you've got your IDA 2, are residents able to actually be confident about their tenure. So it's one example. It's probably one of the more advanced ones in the country. There's lots more on this if you need to drill down and interrogate it. The point being is that these processes happen in parallel with the land acquisition process and don't wait till after the process happens. Another example, which is covered in your course notes, and we won't have time to go into today, is the City of Cape Town's. They have a new zoning called Special Residential 2 Incremental Housing, which is specially designed for incremental upgrading areas. It allows areas to be upgraded at a later stage to an SR1 zoning, and there's much more of this it's well documented, and there's much more of this in your notes. Now let's turn to the spatial planning workstream. Now again, to emphasize, the spatial planning workstream is not there solely to confer tenure rights. It's there for other really important issues, principally and importantly, service provision. It's a process that leads to the eventual determination of the permanent dwelling and informal settlement and its site boundaries. Now, and Monty will have sort of touched on this very briefly in he's going through the different categories of settlements, but essentially 3 settlement variables determine whether the sequence of upgrading in a settlement and the duration of upgrading in the settlement. The first of all is the extent to which relocations are required in a settlement. The question that are all units in a settlement located on land for permanent occupation. So we do know that a B1 zoning or categorization suggests that the land is by and large suitable for permanent occupation. It doesn't necessarily mean that all the land in that settlement is suitable for permanent occupation. So a B1 settlement might have parts of it that need to be cleared. People right in the middle of a floodplain, people located on top of a petrol pipeline or something of the sort. The second question is the question around the settlement capacity. So can we accommodate all of the people, the existing dwellings in the unit, in the settlement within the boundaries of the settlement? This will determine that whether we need to find room for or places to relocate people outside the settlement, which has very important sequencing and duration consequences. We'll come back to that. And then, of course, the question around, do we need to reblock? Can all the existing dwelling units and settlements stay in the same place and still be serviced and meet minimum safety requirements, and principally that's a fire safety issue. So let's have a look at how those three questions, or the three variables, play out in different settlements. So we've got a kind of settlement here. This is Pabalelo in Uppington. We can see here a pretty low density a very low density settlement. But you can see that by overlaying a trial layout on top of it, that all the lands all the houses are located on land that's suited for permanent occupation. It's pretty clear from this trial layout here that we can accommodate all the existing dwellings within the available development area. We might have a couple of guys here that need to relocate, but we can move them onto that site there. And it looks like 90, in this case, 98% of the units, no, well, almost all of the units can be stay where they are. So you've got a yes, yes, yes to those three kinds of questions, which gives us a very simple and straightforward planning sites demarcation certificate. You can very quickly, in this case, overlay a layout over these guys, demarcate the sites, and then at an early stage issue some kind of certificate confirming that people can stay where they are and what their boundaries of site. And thereafter, depending on what land assembly requirements are, etc., one can move to township establishment, general plan, opening of the register, etc. So it's a fairly quick route, though, to get to that point, which is where we need to get to if people are going to know that they can upgrade and spend money on their house where they are. The second type of settlement, for example, would be settlements Havelock Road in Durban. In that case, it's an upgrading being undertaken by Itaquini Municipality in association with the Cardoletu. There, yes, all the units are on land that's suited for permanent occupation. Yes, there's in fact a little bit of land here, so all of the existing dwellings can fit within the development area. But there's a reblocking that's going to be required. There's no way you can take services into this area and achieve minimum fire standards. So we're going to need to do that reblocking that Monty referred to. So in this case, the sequence is not as easy and as simple as the previous one. The sequence in Havelock requires the clearance of some key service corridors, reblocking of the remainder of the settlement, and this could take a good few years. It could take 3-4 years. Then the site layout, then the site tenure certificate. So to get to that point in the Havelock case, because of the requirement for reblocking, is something that is some years away, which then raises the question, what can we do to help people get more secure along the way whilst this work is happening? And we'll talk to that now. And then we've got an extreme example, which is a place called Graveyard Pond. Now the area in the circled red was a wetland and is prone to flooding. So this area is not suited to permanent occupation. So we've got a need to relocate people off a substantial portion of the land that's not suited for permanent occupation. We don't have space to fit those people into the existing area. You can see it's very tight. So the answer there is no. And on top of that, those that are left behind probably can't be serviced where they are and meet minimum safety requirements. So there's going to be, on top of that, a reblocking requirement. So this is a tough one, and it's going to be a long one to get to the site tenure certificate. Essentially, we've got to identify and plan for the relocation of sites. This area here, going to have to acquire a relocation site, can take ages, got to prepare it, you've got to manage the relocation. In parallel, you could possibly do the reblocking of the remainder of the settlement. Then you get to site demarcations, and then site tenure. A pretty long-term process. You're looking 6-8 years if you sit on it hard, probably. What can we do to give people tenure improve tenure security whilst we're going through that process, which then takes us to the next question. So along the way, and particularly in settlements which are complex, like the last two we've seen, there are ways that we can give people improved tenure as we go along. And if we take just the normal, pretty usual sort of planning sequence for an informal settlement, we start with enumerating the settlement. We then map those units. We number them. We find out who occupies those units and whether they're tenants or owners. We do that land assessment that we've been talking about, and this assessment of capacity to accommodate any internal relocations. We assess the reblocking requirement and the relocations requirement. We do the reblocking if required. We do layouts, then we go to layouts confirming site boundaries. And then finally, in the long term, one could go through the township establishment process. Now, along each of those steps along the process, there are things we can do that would give people improved tenure rights, tenure security, before we get to that site. So at the very first step, if we've done an enumeration of settlement occupants, one's able to confirm to the occupancy and the general community that who's registered as an occupant of that settlement. Now that gives important benefits, allows people to get letters confirming that they are resident there, which is needed for SASA grants, voting, cell phone FICA registration, etc. The moment one's done the dwelling mapping and numbering, it becomes possible to provide proof of occupancy of a specific unit. So-and-so is occupant of this unit, which is located at this GPS point in the settlement. And then only at a later stage where you've done your land developability assessment and you think, will you be able to say, well, yeah, we can fit everybody in the settlement, so we can't say that you're going to be accommodated exactly where you are, but there's enough land for you and we can confirm that you will get a site in the settlement. And then after any required reblocking, etc., only then do you start to be able to provide people with a right to a specific site with the corner pegs and the coordinates of corner pegs confirmed. And this can be done ahead of township establishment and opening of the general plan, etc. So we can see as we go down the planning process, and which may be quick or slow depending on the nature of the settlement, there are different ways that we can start to give people improved tenure as we go down the tenure security continuum. And this again tells people how, gives people on a progressive basis a increased sense of where they stand tenure right-wise. This table I won't go through, it's in your course notes, but in each case, you can start to get a sense of what we could put onto a tenure certificate or a letter or some document that sets out a person's tenure rights. So as you go through the planning, and you're not doing it just for tenure, I again emphasize that, but as you go along and you go through the different stages of the planning process, you are able and should in fact start to confirm and improve people's rights. All right, now let's turn to the final work stream, the tenure administration work stream. Now by that we mean the process through which we identify the rights of a settlement occupant has to a dwelling on night, deal with disputes about those rights, record that right, provide evidence of that right, because people need to show that they have a right from time to time, and maintain the record or capture the changes. Now, we do know, and depending on the nature of the settlement, that there's we have occupancy churn in informal settlements. Some it's high, sometimes it's low. The lower settlements, the one that I'm familiar with at the moment, about 5% of the households turn over every year. So even in well-established settlements, there's a turnover of settlements. For whatever reason, people work elsewhere, people move back to the rural areas, etc. So any record of occupancy can become quickly outdated unless you update it on an ongoing basis. So that first step in that process, occupancy registers and registration of household, if that's not maintained, it's not going to be much use the year after next. And we also know that disputes over tenure occur from time to time. So you enumerate, you record somebody as an occupant of the household, they tell you they're the owner, and then 3 months later, somebody arrives back and said, no, I lent my shack to that person. I'm now back. It's actually my unit, and there's a squabble. So we need to develop under the administration work stream. We need to find or develop mechanisms for identifying land rights, arbitrating disputes, recording, and providing evidence of rights to a tenure, and to keep that up to date as changes occur. But how? There's essentially 3 generic options you can adopt to do that. The one is the one that we're very familiar with, the statutory system. Use systems established by government and governed by legislation and statute. The deeds registry system, I'll come to that. We can use locally recorded systems, essentially systems that are developed and run at the local community level. Or you can use systems that are not the deeds registry system, that are established outside the community, often at a municipality level. And so we'll come to those now. And there are possible combinations of the two. So let's have a closer look at those 3 generic options. Well, the statutory recording and maintenance system is basically the title deed register system, the registrar of deeds, the surveyor general, authorized conveyances, and is established established system of doing that. It is expensive, and it can be quite time consuming, and it can be it can only really start, or can only start, once land acquisition has been secured. And as we dealt with in this webinar, the land acquisition processes can be very, very slow. In the case of Pabalelo in the northeast, or in Uppington, this could be quite quick. If this land was government, it could be quite quick. But in other areas, it's not really a short-term option, because there's a whole lot of land acquisition and land reconfiguration processes that need to happen. So the second option then is to start to look at local land recording and maintenance system. Now these are extensive, and many communities have some or quite a lot of the system in place already. There could be a local land transfer being witnessed by a local leader. It could be a community leader coming in, or councillor coming in and using the neighbours to verify authenticity of a claim in the case of dispute. Some committees actually maintain their own local register. So there are different ways of using local systems. But more often than not, you'll find that there's some kind of system in place already, particularly in your more established settlements. And in these cases, it makes a lot of sense to work with what exists. And if it's working, don't try and fix it. Rather work with what's there in place. I think just to add again the point that many NGOs and social movements in this country have built the capacity to work with communities to do this dwelling mapping and occupancy enumeration. So these are some guys working just last year, or this year in fact, in some of the settlements in eThekwini as part of their Kazaleta team. Partially over here is a participant in this webinar himself. So if you've got any questions on that, maybe you can direct it to. The point being is that there is capacity in this country around that. There are ways of doing it. So look to, it's not an unviable way of doing it. You just need to find out what there is. So the third option is to look to administrative recording and maintenance. So that could be anything. This could be your local electricity department who registers households for prepaid meters, and while they're doing it, they take ID numbers of the people in the occupant, they allocate a number, they take a GPS point. So in a way, that's recording an occupancy right, and often it's taken by the residents to be a confirmation of tenure status. Other municipalities also, or instead, assemble land dwelling registers, lists of residents. This is a case here where a person is, I think it's in Lusaka, where dwellings are being numbered and occupants of that are there. So in some cases, many municipalities are doing that already. So it makes sense to find out what's, in looking about that, addressing the question of how we're going to administer that, to find out what municipal systems are at play and see whether you can work with those, adapt them, combine them with locally community-based systems as well. So look for hybrids. That's your third option. What very interesting pilot that's just in the early stages is by the Transaction Support Center, which is based in Cape Town. They're looking to using blockchain, which is the technology that is used for cryptocurrencies, such as cryptocurrencies. They're looking now to using that technology to start to record tenure rights in an informal settlement. It's at an early stage, but has very interesting potential. If you're interested in interrogating that, you can have a look at the YouTube link, which is provided in your course notes. And that's the end of it. Now I'd like to hand over to Monty to do the wrap. Monty.
Yep. Thanks, Clive. And I must also thank the participants. I mean, this is quite technical, and I kept checking how many people would have left, and very few have. Well, I don't think anybody's left. Some of you might have lost. Might have lost your connectivity, but you come back again. So let's see what we said in this webinar. We said at the household level, improving tenure can make a huge difference to households' well-being. Psychological issues, the social issues, the economic issues. It also confers, quite importantly, a sense of being a citizen of a place or a town. What we're saying as well is tenure improvements can be undertaken incrementally and does not have to wait until the completion of the upgrading process. The acquisition of privately owned land and township proclamation. So what we're saying is some of these things can be taken providing tenure in an incremental way. And then we've got to remember, although we talk of new legislation around expropriation, In some instances, some municipalities, well, most municipalities actually do have the right to expropriate when it comes to the issues in relation to acquisition of privately owned land. Then the third point is what we're arguing is don't only see the upgrading of informal settlements on a project by project basis. You've got to understand it in terms of your whole municipality, in terms of your whole town, in terms of your whole metropolitan area. So it's a municipality-wide program, and the legal and enablement processes need to be rapidly undertaken in order to enable improved tenure for informal settlements residents. So you're looking at your SDFs, you're looking at your enabling issues in relation to SPLUMA, etc. So this is, as we've indicated, this is primarily through the inclusion of informal settlements into municipal spatial planning, zoning, and regulatory systems. This does not need to wait for formal land acquisition, township establishment, etc. So we're making 2 points. One is project level, you do it incrementally. You don't have to wait for issues. At the municipal wide level, what you're doing is you're saying we're looking at the whole municipality, and this is, are we going to include the upgrading on informal settlements at a program level. Then number 4, at the settlement level, a set of project level planning steps needs to be undertaken to identify what tenure rights can be granted at what stage. In some cases, this can be done in a single simple step. In other cases, where relocations and reblocking is required, the whole process could take much longer. But I think it's quite important that we understand that we are dealing with not only with settlements, we are dealing with people, we're dealing with households, and so we have to deal with some of the social and other issues at play. Even in these cases, incremental steps which improve tenure security along the way can be taken at an early stage. And then I think there's a final point, Clive, if I'm right. Finally, a system for the administration of land tenure rights needs to be thought through. This does not have to involve the development of entirely new systems, but could be additions to existing community or municipal systems. And we've given you a number of examples, everything from prepaid meter registration to check numbering, etc., etc. So what we've tried to show you in this, well, a reasonably short webinar is there are a number of things that need to happen. Now, the participants here would have to be quite flexible, on the one hand, understand the social conditions in which they're working, but also understand there's a whole bunch of things that's technically possible and that can help people feel more secure, that it can assist stabilizing unstable parts of our towns and cities, and that can be a useful addition to us, as the president said this morning at the SALGA conference, that we can improve the quality of people's lives. So thank you for that, and I think I'm handing over to Margot.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. I've been dealing with the questions in the Q&A session. And there have been a couple of questions that have just come through on the in the last 2 minutes. Sorry, I'll read them out, and then I think the panel can see how to answer and how to engage with them. So, okay, so we've had a very interesting discussion on the Q&A around the question of lease agreements and leaseholding of land, and that is an interesting option, and that in conjunction with blockchaining. So I think if people want to follow that particular line of conversation, please go ahead and have a look at the Q&A. And the question just comes through from Monica Mkwena. It says, what are the best options if the settlement is too dense and there's no vacant land in the township that the settlement is in? What is the best option to bring in infrastructure? I don't know if Clive, Marla, and Monty, you want to respond to that? I don't know if you heard the question. Okay, you need to just be unmuted, I think.
Monty, you want to have a go, or is it?
Go for it, Clive.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of work that's being done now, looking at how we can work with the densities that we find in a settlement that one wants to, without in fact creating a pile of relocation requirements. So the big issue often in the dense settlements is how do you secure enough space between units? How do you secure fire safety? Because the dense settlements are generally very, very vulnerable to fire. A basic service provision, but still maintain densities. So a number of, in my part of the world, there are a number of initiatives and looking to developing technologies that allow it. That, I think, is a webinar in and of itself. It's a whole pile of work. By and large, there are new ways, and there are a whole new ways, set of ways looking at work in the dense settlements, enabling double-story construction being a really important part of that. Adopting new technologies that recognize the existing densities and minimize any requirement for de-densification. So for an example, I mean, the settlement, one of the settlements I'm working in now has got a density of close to 300 dwelling units a hectare in part. And we're looking to have no relocate from that settlement through enabling vertical expansion, double-story units, and associated with reblocking. I think, again, an example of that which was pioneered is in Mshimi 1, which did a reblocking, retained incredibly high levels of density as well. So short, as I'm really saying, is that, yeah, in many cases, relocations are not necessary.
Super, thanks, Clive. That's very helpful. Another comment that's come up twice now from two different of our participants is the question around what happens when the landowners do not want to give access until after sale. So they don't want to allow any kind of incremental tenure. So what do people do? What do the officials do in those situations where the private landowner says, actually, can't do anything on my land until after it's out of my possession?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it has been a difficulty. There's a number of things that we need to take into account when we're looking at that. In the first instance, for a long time, municipalities had the right to expropriate. And one of the difficulties that we faced with is the political will to expropriate. Now, I remember years ago, what is now called Shepisong, we actually expropriated The only thing that the landowners could do was go to court to deal with the issue of whether there was fair compensation. But then you have every right to continue the development. And so the development of that project went ahead and it's done. But I can't remember particularly in Gauteng area in recent years where there has been the political will to expropriate. And that is one of the key issues that we need to look at. Obviously, looking at negotiation first, obviously at giving options, first right for people for the owner to just say to him, okay, why don't you develop the land? You can do that in terms of the Gauteng rapid land release program, etc., etc. If people are still too reluctant, I was going to use a different word. If people are still reluctant, then government must use the mechanisms available to them.
Well, if I could chip in on that. The eThekwini municipality, through part of the Akaza Letu program, have got two legal opinions. Basically say that from senior counsel, that basically state that if you've done the basic zoning, that's the idea zonings we were talking about earlier. If you notify the owners and you follow a particular process, municipalities are empowered to install basic services on private land. So it's quite important. I think it started there's some of the references in your course note that start to deal with that there is important legal precedent. It's legally sound that you are, as a municipality, enabled to move into settlement and provide at least basic services if you follow a set of legal processes, and the landowner can't stop you doing that.
Great, thanks so much for that. And Monty, that's very helpful. Another question that's just come up on the chat is, what are we doing with the ongoing influx of people in the UISP projects? Since it's such a long process and the number of beneficiaries keeps on growing. That is a big question now. Anyone want to have a go at that?
It's been a constant discussion in the many workshops we've had in many municipalities. The question has been either in general about influx control, and that's when we decided to kind of hold in shame, because we remind us of pre-1994, or specifically, how do you deal with issues related to increasing densities in informal settlements, especially when you start saying, hey, we're going to upgrade that informal settlement. And it's a very difficult issue. I think, sometimes there are simple answers to it, and mobilize community around managing its own affairs. Do municipalities have the capacity to deal with it? We know many municipalities have their own departments that deal with land invasions, okay? And some of them have got really bad reputations as a result of that. And so the issue is, there's an urban management issue. The issue is, can you get people to buy in to saying that they will assist in their own in the management of their own settlements, because once those settlements start densifying, in effect, what you're saying to them, you are decreasing your rights that we're already trying to give to you in the meantime. And then the second point is there the capacity within municipalities and the will within municipalities to do proper urban management? And this is a very, very difficult question. And there are no easy answers to that. That's why I admire people that want to get involved in the upgrade of informal settlements. They're either mad or they are very brave.
Thanks, Monty. There's been a challenge that's come up that says, it's very interesting, from Satish Mohan, who says, in going multi-story, and I assume in situ as well, are we not creating unsightly developments with clothes, bedding hanging from balconies, also the issue of people with disabilities? So I think that's just a question around us going into the vertical of BNGs or RDPs. So there's a question around whether it's aesthetic or not. I don't know, Marla, do you want to have a think about that?
I think thank you, Margot. I hope my sound doesn't let me down. It's
Sounds good so far.
okay, let's go with as much as I can. I think in that, if we're speaking in situ, and Clive made mention of that, I know working or it's almost being tried out in eThekwini, having, but it's one household that is going, in situ, not proposing high density upgrading as far as I understand it too. So that would be the typical BNG stuff that is currently happening in Ekurhuleni. So for in situ upgrading, I think if it's going up for one household, not for multiple households. And then Monty brought up an important management. That it's severely lacking in our municipalities and bylaw management as well. So I think those are issues. I hope I answered Satish in saying that for in situ upgrading, I don't believe it's going to be multiple story. The BNG part is now tending to go multiple story.
Great, thanks, Marla. There's a question from Ndamuso, sorry, he says, we have a new case of informal settlement where the community has resolved to start. We met with the leasing committee to listen to what they have planned, and they are adamant to continue settling on this land. They have no intention of backing down. What are the key issues that you would advise us to pay attention to at this stage? So, I mean, they really are at a very early stage of this engagement, so it's a really good question.
I just have to ask Margot for clarity. There's the 24. Has it exceeded the 24-hour time frame that the settlement is there? So is it an established informal settlement?
Can you write? It's an established informal settlement or a new one? We'll be able to answer it to you. The Tulani and Corsi has asked the question, can the landowner object to the rezoning of the land? That's an interesting question. I assume when it's about to be transferred. Clive, you seem to be smiling. Shall I hand that to you?
Yeah, I'm not a great statutory planner, but my understanding is that yes, you do need to advertise for the rezoning of the land as a municipality. You need to give the landowner and other people an opportunity to object, but that if it's in the public interest, the municipality finds that it's in the public interest, the it can proceed and with the rezoning, notwithstanding the objection of the landowner. So the landowner doesn't have a veto right on the rezoning of their land.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And Domiso has come back and said that it's a new settlement, but we're just trying to find out how new. So let's just see. She says it's more than 48 hours.
Oh,
So,
okay.
okay.
So then that's an established informal settlement. So I think the first thing that, you know, the municipality would have to do is engage the leadership of that community, or try and understand the dynamics of that community, because, you know, in no point do we want to promote shack lordism. And I think it will be critical that before it becomes a too established 20-year-old informal settlement, the municipality will have to start engaging the leadership of that settlement to try and put in plans in place and try and sort as much as possible out before it starts densifying and becomes an unmanageable informal settlement. And there was the report that was done, I think, a few years ago by a FISA's core plan on urban land management. I think if they could just get a copy of that to see how to get in and how to manage new, more than 48-hour-old informal settlements, I think it provides quite a lot of important ways in which that can be managed. I'm not sure, Margot sort of disappeared, Monty. Margot, come back to the hot seat.
I'm so sorry. I apologize to everybody. Somebody was at my door knocking crazily. So my sincere apologies. Thank you very much for that, Marla. Okay, we've got time for exactly one more question, then I'm afraid we're going to have to close. So, and I think it's a very pertinent question that's come up, which is from Nick Merver. And he says a lot of invasion has a political motive, especially now in the running up to the municipal elections in 2021. What advice can you give? Now that's a big question.
Well, I think there's two issues. And I've been involved in a number of discussions around this. The one issue is that there has been an uptick in the unauthorized, I'm using politically correct words, okay? In the unauthorized occupation of land in the period of the lockdown. And there's been a couple of arguments that some people or many people have been evicted from their backyards that they were renting. So, and particularly, if Tulani is still hearing, particularly in the south of Johannesburg, it's become quite widespread, and it's led to a lot of tension. So, one of the issues is the motivation. Is the issue of economic hardship, or one of the reasons. The second issue is, I'm sure there are situations where there is a political motivation. Okay, we're not naive enough not to know that. We also know, and I think we must go back to what Mala said, there is opportunities for people to make money out of it. Now, if we are talking simply about political motivation, the issue is, and I've raised it before, is does that municipality or whatever government authority there is, does it have the political will to deal with it? If there is a situation where it's about next year's elections being an official in government is going to be a very hard place to be.
Great, thank you. I know that there's some more questions in the Q&A, and I'm afraid we've run out of time. What you can do is you can follow up with us on our email address, which is nusp.workshops@gmail.com. I've put it into the chat, so you can send any issues there if you need to, and we can try and help you a little bit there. So we can certainly do that. But in the meantime, I'm afraid I'm going to have to hand back to Marla to close the proceedings and to say thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Margot. Colleagues, thank you very much for your active participation. It's really appreciated. We understand the dynamics, the stresses, the pressures that happen on the ground, and you know, this is just one effort to try and help you wade through the process of informal settlement upgrading. Margot did mention the email address. I think that's where you got your invites from. We will also be circulating any information such as Ronald's, the AFIS's core plan document, as well as I think there'll be the clip on YouTube of this session, which we will also circulate on that email. And if you have any pertinent questions that you'd want to have answered, we can use that email to direct you. I'd want to just say thank you to our NUSP provincial champions. I just managed to see flightingly Shemu was present, Muzi, Shemu from the Eastern Cape, Muzi from the Northwest, Likitseng from the Free State, Charlotte from Mpumalanga. Then we had our metros represented by Sarah from eThekwini and Vianney from Buffalo City. I may just get them wrong, I apologize, but thank you guys. Our next webinars will start.
And Tulani from Joburg.
Oh yes, and Tulani, our usual suspects. So our next webinar, colleagues, will be in Feb and March. And webinar 2 would be on how to plan an in-situ upgrading project. And webinar 3 is how to plan for incremental engineering services. And colleagues, we obviously in this time of COVID, as soon as we know that we are comfortable enough to resume our normal capacity development workshops, we'll engage you and advise you of that. I'd like to say thank you to the Shisaka team. You guys have really pulled this one off, and Matthew has got his congregation now and he can start preaching. And that's a side joke we shared.
You've been pastor now.
Yeah. And then colleagues, thank you for your attendance. Be safe over the festive season, and we will see you at our next webinar. Okay, keep well.